Hey everybody, what's up? I'm Don Carr. I'm here with Mason Marangella, and this is What's on Your Pedal Board. Obviously, we've got a different pedal board here. There was a reason for this. There was some sort of inspiration, some sort of idea that you had. Please enlighten us.
The last pedal board that I think I showed off was just a standard kind of like mono pedal board. It had a lot of, different style pedals on it. And I think I remember one of the things that was different about it is that I had the option to either run through a simulated speaker cabinet and or like IR loader, and I think that was the 2 Notes Cab M was the name of the product, or I could run to the front of an amp, or I could run both at the same time if I wanted, but it was all in mono. For this rig, since gigging is kind of coming back a little bit and I really like playing blues, I wanted to build something that was like really specifically for more bluesier type tones. So the pedal selection for the most part reflects that style of music, although there are some that might work for other stuff. And I also wanted to run it as a wet, dry, wet rig, and kind of doing a style of wet, dry, wet that I've been evangelizing for a long time, which is still just using one amplifier as the dry amp, and then using cabinet simulations to do sort of the wet side of the speaker cabinet mic simulation and power amp simulation. So you can just show up to a gig with one amp, but you can occupy 3 channels, have the dry in the middle, and have the wet processing effects hard pan left and right. And I'll get into more of what that means while we go through it, but just to kind of give you a rough overview of kind of what we're doing here and kind of what the impetus was.
Yeah, well, and clearly that's a lot of firepower, and that's a small package, which is really cool.
17 inches wide by 10 inches deep.
Man, yeah, very easy to carry.
Yes, very easy. So the way that it starts is the guitar, and we have a beautiful Strat here, is coming into a full tone Clyde Deluxe wah.
Okay.
And this, to me, it maybe doesn't look the most vintage of all the wahs that are out there, but I think anybody who has used a lot of wah in a touring capacity, it can be really hard to get them to stay reliable. The pots often fail. There's just inherent issues in the mechanical build of a wah.
Noise issues, with the scratchy pot and whatever. Yeah.
And I think full tone is really just doing the best job mechanically of anybody. There's some wahs out there that sound really fantastic, and this is also in that category, but I think beyond just sounding fantastic, it will work. I've had certain versions. I have a white version of the same full-tone Clyde Deluxe that I've had for like 12 years, and it's still as good as it was the first day I ever had it. So really great, reliable wah pedals. If you're a touring musician, you just want something that's rock solid, I don't think you can do much better than the full-tone.
Yeah, I have to agree with that completely.
It has a couple of different selections. I really don't actually use any of these selections except for the Jimmy setting, which I think is kind of the most classic, kind of like Voxy style. I don't use the output buffer that's on it, which is just kind of making it more optimized if you're going to run it into a fuzz that's impedance sensitive. It doesn't lose that sweep. I kind of like when it loses that sweep, so it doesn't bother me. So I just leave the buffer disengaged. I leave it on the Jimmy setting, and I kind of just set the input gain at unity. And it's just a great wah. It's just great for just the.
Yeah, right in the vocal range, man. That's the thing. It's very wah, it's very vocal.
Yeah, and again, as I said, there's plenty of great wahs out there. Yeah. I mean, even just a regular old Crybaby is great. I mean, you can get those tones out of it. It's just for me, that one is just unbeatable in terms of the reliability, and if I just don't want to mess around with having an issue, it's just great to know that it's going to be reliable. I'm gonna step on it, it's going to work.
Yep.
And sounds great. So
yeah,
I like the Clyde. From there, I'm then coming into my pedal board, which has one of our interface boxes that you can get at Sweetwater, and it's one of the module-based ones. And I'm coming in to a passive input, so there's no buffer because I have some impedance-sensitive stuff right up front. Oh, okay. So I come in first. I go into a Sonic Research tuner, which is a little bit confusing to use for some people. It's a strobe tuner, and it can sometimes be difficult to tell like where exactly it is in tune. We once put these on a demo board, And it was very confusing to the people coming by our booths to understand whether it was in tune or not. But I really like this style of tuner. It's really easy to see. It's really compact. And I think Sonic Research makes some great stuff. And I also, on other pedal boards use Boss tuners or TC tuners. Sure. I'm not really that picky. This is kind of what I had that was in the small size that I needed in order to fit it. And so that's what went on the board. But it's also just happens to be a really great tuner. It's true bypass, so it's not going to mess with any, again, of the impedance sensitive stuff that I have up front.
Nice. And you use it as a mute, right?
I just use it as a mute, yeah. And I have a volume pedal a little later down on the channel. I'll explain that later. And that's another alternative mute that's after all of the dry effects. But in any case, got the tuner up front first. And then it goes to this kind of crazy looking Univibe pedal that really looks the part of an old vintage Univibe. And it's made by a company in Argentina called Ibanez. And there's so many amazing Univibe makers, including Full Tone with the Deja Vibe is kind of a real classic. And there's a lot of guys now that have really gone off the deep end to try to recreate one-to-one, as far as the photocells and all that stuff, to really nail the essence of the original Univibe. This is one. Another one that I really like is called the Sir Henry. There's another one by Weaver Effects that's really pretty amazing that's also kind of going after the same vibe, and no pun intended on the vibe. But one cool thing that I really like about this, which is kind of part of the reason why I put it on there, because there's a lot that sound great, is that it has this cancel feature. So normally when you're using a vintage Univibe and you're hooking up the expression pedal, you can cancel the modulation component, but leave in the preamp of the vibe and kind of use it as a way to boost other effects. And it also does a cool thing with fuzzes. And because this is before my fuzz, I can use it to kind of boost up the fuzz and kind of get some alternative sounds out of it. So let's hear it first. This is just going to be, in the chorus mode of the vibe, and I kind of have roughly the intensity and speed set at noon, and the volume's all the way up, just like with an old Univibe. They lose some volume, so you kind of have to get it on the, kind of the upper half of the volume control there to kind of make it break even with the output. So here's dry. Here's the vibe. Super lush.
Yeah, big and chewy, man. It really is.
And the thing that all the, the vibe guys that, are really into it, they always talk about this elusive term called double pulse. And few of them have it. This is one of them that does. And the cancel feature is cool because if I have the vibe sound on here, right, so I hit cancel. I still have a boosted signal, but I have no modulation. So here it is off with no vibe, just the boosted preamp section. So preamp in. It just really sounds great at adding a little bit more to the system if I kind of want an early boost before I hit any of the other pedals.
Exactly. It's like having an extra built-in boost pedal, man.
Absolutely.
Really nice.
Yeah, so really great, and again, really chewy, has that double pulse.
Yeah.
From there, it then goes into the Prescription Electronics Experience Fuzz. And these have kind of become popular in the last they were always fairly popular amongst Hendrix fans, but guys like Doyle Bramhall, the second, and also Gary Clark Jr. famously started using these, and it's kind of the sound of like the Gary Clark Jr. Bright Lights intro, and it's really, really a great fuzz. It also has an onboard octave, which I don't really use very much. I mostly just use the fuzz, and then there's also a swell feature when you're in that octave mode, which I also really don't use. But the fuzz just sounds outstanding for that sort of thing. So if you're doing kind of the Gary Clark Jr. thing, it's like that. Sounds absolutely huge.
It's gargantuan. Man.
Yeah, and
it really is.
You put it with some of the vibe, and it's absolutely insanely huge. I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of the biggest fuzz sounds you'll get.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And you know, and it seems sensitive too. It seems like it's sensitive to input levels and playing dynamics.
It's less sensitive, I would say, than like a good fuzz face, germanium fuzz face is. Like it, I would say that of the fuzzes that are out there, it's one of the like less good ones. I'll give you an example. So here's all the way up, right? Here's like halfway down. Some of those old fuzz faces will almost get like chimier as you bring it down.
Sure.
But my workaround for this is I have a treble booster that comes after the fuzz that's all the way on my left-hand side here that's made by Analog Noir. This is a small outfit, also based in California like me, who does like really great hand-wired, just like custom stuff, does fuzzes and stuff like that. And he made me this treble booster to the Cesar Diaz spec because I needed something that was small, and I really loved all those Cesar Diaz pedals that he had made, maybe 10 or 20 years ago. Yeah. And so this is reinterpreting the values that Cesar chose for his treble booster. And this can actually help get some cleanup because this is a germanium treble booster and really kind of helps if I have the fuzz on, normally the fuzz is, here's the fuzz on with no treble booster. And if I rolled it down, you heard it didn't sound that good before. If I bring this in and I roll it down, I have... I wouldn't say it sounds bone clean.
No, but that's great though because it's back into kind of the usable range of the instrument. You know what I mean? Like that upper mid stuff that really cuts through. But it doesn't seem to add any like gain back into the back into the circuit.
And you have a three-way toggle, so you can kind of choose what you want to exaggerate.
Yeah. So this is after the fuzz, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
It's after the fuzz. And if I went like let's say more high end, right, and I wanted to kind of get a little bit more top out of it. With the fuzz, it can definitely get like. It can definitely help just get a little bit more dynamic to it. Mm-hmm. But speaking of next in the order, it is the Analog Noir, and what I really like doing is kind of setting it to the mid sound. Even though it's technically a treble booster, these are sort of different shades of treble. But using it in the mid to me does something really cool, where it you hear that noise that's kind of common with like treble boosters and fuzzes when you turn the volume off and you turn them on, they kind of have a little hiss to them. I like it that it makes like a very 70s Clapton, like Derek and the Dominoes type of tweedy sound to it almost, where it kind of makes the amp sound a little smaller, but in a really cool way, because all those kind of tweed champ sounds, they were a little bit boxy.
Oh yeah.
But it was part of that sound when you're hearing Layla or whatever, and you step on this and you can really get that like, it really does kind of nail what that does and kind of gives you, again, that really kind of... It gives you definitely a more boxy sound, but it is kind of cool, again, if you're trying to do that tweed sort of thing. It kind of... The tweeds have a ratty sort of distortion to them.
Exactly, and they're with a champ especially, the speaker's tiny, the power section's tiny, it's just tiny sounding.
Everything
and then
about it.
That fuzz is so big on the bottom end that, with the combination of the two kind of gives you the best of both.
It's beautiful, and by itself, it really cleans up great. If I like add some modulation to it and some delay, you'll hear that it really just kind of has like a... Really sounds great when you have it just dialed back. You get those really beautiful chimey cleans, and it's different than the straight ahead clean tone. Like if I just went, totally bypassed. but it doesn't have quite like the presence and the chiminess that you might get out of like a tweedier sort of amp, or even a Marshall with like a little more presence to it. So it kind of does that in a cool way, I think.
Yeah, yeah. It takes something that, well, I mean, it's re-EQing the sound basically in a general sense, and it's in the most important frequencies, the upper mids, where where that's kind of where the guitar lives.
It's really pretty great. So I mean, already you see that I kind of have like a boost that I can use before fuzz with the funky vibe by bypassing the vibe section, and then I can use the analog noir after the fuzz, so I can kind of EQ and boost on both sides of the fuzz, and that kind of helps me get a little bit more control over what the fuzz is doing.
Yeah, right. The thing that I noticed, it's interesting because when you were playing the fuzz, I noticed in the pick attack that it was very dynamic in the pick attack, but then like say when you rolled the volume off and it was getting less input volume, it had a completely different character.
Yeah.
Which is was really interesting. But when you were picking, it's like a louder note was really big and a softer note was softer.
Yeah. God bless treble boosters. Yeah.
No kidding, man.
So after the analog noir treble booster, I know it's kind of like all the way over here spatially on the pedal board. It then comes back to this TS9.
Yeah.
And I don't perv out on the different versions of the Tube Screamer. Some people are like, it's got to be the JRC 455-8. You know what? Like, the truth is that if you have a Tube Screamer, it's going to pretty much do the thing. And I feel like, it's like pizza. It's all good. You can't go wrong with cheese and tomato sauce and bread, right? So the Tube Screamer really just does it well. This is a TS9. It sounds great. It doesn't have the fancy chip or anything like that. And but it serves the function. And with a Strat and a Fender style amp, we just have a reissued deluxe here.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's supposed to.
Yeah, it does the thing.
It does the thing. I generally use the drive pretty low, like on the lower half of 50%, the level pretty far up, and the tone pretty far up, because I think that's the best way to run it. I don't think it gets too compressed in the band, like the bandwidth just kind of shrinks if you use too much of the drive. Yeah. But it's sounds great for those kind of rhythmy, Stevie Ray Vaughan-ish. I mean, of course, you have to have a Tube Screamer, otherwise, you're never going to get there.
Right.
So I like it for, I generally don't actually ever use it by itself, or rarely do I use it by itself. Almost always I'm stacking it with the pedal that comes after it, which is the Steel String Supreme, which is our take on a Dumble clean sound. And I think there's always a lot of confusion when you invoke the Dumble name. Yeah. People, I think, usually assume Robin Ford, Larry Carlton, the more overdriven sounds. This is doing the single channel clean Dumble sound, which has some compression, is kind of like a beefed up Fender twin reverb, but with a little bit of gain, a little bit more complexity to the clean tone. And I pair that with the Tube Screamer in order to kind of get what I consider to be sort of the ultimate balance of sort of a low to mid gain tone. So if I were to just step on the Tube Screamer, let's say, and you hear that sound, and then I step on the Steel String Supreme SRV, there's a thing that I feel like the Tube Screamer alone can't achieve, especially through a clean amp like a Fender. There's a certain glass on the top end and a certain snap on the low end that you just can't get if you're only using a Tube Screamer, because automatically you're getting that mid-range hump, you're losing a lot of your top, you're losing a lot of your bottom, and then this kind of represents the amp side of kind of what Stevie Ray had going on when he was using a Steel String Singer or a Super Reverb or a Vibro Verb. All these are really cranked amps. And then the Tube Screamer is more acting like a way to control that low end and that bass. It wasn't really driving so much in terms of the gain produced by the pedal. It was more in terms of what it was doing
to the amp. Exactly. The way it was hitting the front end and again, taking the low end off, taking the high end off. But you got to have, but that's more the starting point at that point.
Right. Yeah. It also just sounds great if you're just using it as a regular clean tone. Like, so here's just the straight ahead clean tone, just the amp. Bring this in. Just the compression alone, if you're doing, it just sounds like it has just a lot more life to it. Again, just doing the same thing. So I think you could hear just the amount of harmonic complexity that it offers, you know, relative to the clean tone.
Yeah, again, man, it's boosting that critical upper mid stuff. You
Yeah.
know, that really makes the guitar come to life, and it hits the front end of the amp a little different too.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's not like it's adding a whole lot of gain. This is not a distortion pedal. It's almost like EQing, compressing it, and maybe adding the slightest amount of maybe a really light amount of gain, but it's not like. So this is my basic tone. I'm leaving this thing pretty much always on no matter what it is that I'm doing, and then I'm just stacking other pedals with it. Yeah. So from there, it goes back into our interface, hits an output buffer, which feeds a passive volume pedal. And this is wired through an audition loop that I have in the actual interface, which is included again in the same interfaces that you'd buy from Sweetwater of our Vertex buffered module. If I unplug the volume pedal, it would just normalize as though there were no volume pedal here at all. I could also put external pedals out here if I wanted that would be wired after the Steel String Supreme SRV in terms of the signal path, but I'm just using this for a volume pedal if I needed to do, you know, some sort of volume swell or. So Dunlop, that's just a Volume X8, I believe it's called. Yeah. And, you know, I mostly like just, you know, as robust volume pedal as I can get that's, you know, reasonably sized. I'll use a Dunlop, I'll use an Ernie Ball. You know, they're all kind of roughly the same as far as I'm concerned tone-wise, especially if you're driving it with a buffer. The impedance isn't so important anymore. You could use a low impedance one or a high impedance one. It's all going to work about the same.
Right. So that was a dig at me, obviously, right? The whole like size of the volume pedal thing. Yeah, right?
Yeah, it's subconsciously.
Me and my giant visual volume pedal.
Yeah, and in fact, if you're watching right now, we're starting to GoFundMe to get Don a proper volume pedal to get him away from the visual sound volume pedal. And that's no slight on visual sound. They make a wonderful volume pedal, but it is unsightly, and the size of it is just unruly for a normal pedal board.
It absolutely is, but you know what? The lights, man. I'm hooked. Now I'm hooked on the lights because you look down and you go, you know exactly where you are. As opposed to that gray area of, I think I'm loud enough. Oh, gosh, I'm not even close. Whoops. You know.
But how did we make do? The show. Think of the old Showbud. Was there lights on an old Showbud?
Not even close, man.
Anyway, I digress. We'll leave you alone on your volume pedal proclivities.
No, we're good. We're good.
But are we okay?
No, I think we're okay. All right, moving on.
Okay, so after the volume pedal, it then goes out to the front of the amplifier. So it comes back into my audition loop. Then it feeds the output buffer, which goes back to the front of the amplifier, right into the input of the Deluxe. Right. Then on the Deluxe, you'll notice that I have a line-out box that's made by Custom Audio Electronics and AKA Robert Bradshaw that I've had for quite a while that is just tapping off the output transformer, you know, patting it down to line level, and then I have just a actual level control where I can control how much that signal is hitting the front of my wet processing effects, because these are now running in parallel with my actual dry amp, which is the Deluxe Reverb. So from that line out box, it feeds the J Rockett clockwork. Now you may be looking at this thing and saying, this doesn't look at all like a J Rockett clockwork. Well, it's a sad story, in fact. I had left several pedals in my home studio on a windowsill. And recently in California, we experienced these crazy heat waves where it was upwards of 100 degrees, and it actually peeled off the laminate on the clockwork, and it made it where it kind of curled the edges to the point where I couldn't put them back down where they would stay down, and I kind of was competing with some kind of like almost like paper cuts that were constantly occurring as a result of using the pedal. So I unfortunately, and I need to talk to Chris Van Tassel at Rockett about this to see if I can get a new plate. So I took off the plate and I just used Label Maker on it because I needed to know what the knobs did. Right. But this is not a prototype. This isn't some other device. This is a J Rockett audio clockwork, and it is by far the best analog delay. You heard it here first. The best analog delay that has been made in the last decade. The same person that designed the original Memory Man, they hired to design this version of a Memory Man replica. It sounds absolutely insanely good. It is cleaner than any of the other types of Memory Mans that are out there, and it has the right idiosyncrasies because every Memory Man has those. And they replicate that really well. The modulation control is available on a foot switch. It has tap tempo. So all the modern amenities that you'd want of a fully analog delay are here. And it absolutely nails the tone if you're into the Eric Johnson thing. I just wanted to have as many analog pedals on my board as possible, and having a good analog delay that was stereo, this does it. The original Memory Man wasn't stereo either.
Yeah, and had the weird power supply and all. Man, that thing, I mean, I agree completely, man. Chris nailed it. That is it. Well, Howard Davis, right?
Yeah.
Was the original. But yeah, they nailed it, man. The sound of the repeats is perfect.
Yeah, and it has the weirdness. You like, not all the repeats are perfect, and sometimes it'll actually like kind of like give you an irregular repeat in there that's not part of the sequence.
Right.
But that's kind of part of what made the Memory Man so cool, is that they were sort of unpredictable, and you know, they marketed them like replacements for tape delays, like a solid state version of a tape delay. And this really just sounds. It just has the perfect amount of just kind of like funkiness to it. It's imperfect, but it's beautiful in its imperfection. I can't get over it. I run it in stereo. I don't use the modulation from it too often because I use a chorus to follow it. But it's a really amazing delay. If you want the best analog delay that's made in the last 10 years, here it is. Look no further. Your work is done.
There you go. He did the work for you. Thank you.
I did it for you. I put in the hours, and I can't recommend it more highly. The next thing on the pedal board is another pedal that I can't speak more highly of, is the Boss DC2W. And in my opinion, it's the best Waza Craft version that they've done. And the cool thing that they did is they added that rack unit tone to it, the SDD 320, and that was like what Steve Stevens used on like Flesh for Fantasy with Billy Idol.
Yeah.
And it's just an amazing sounding unit. And I have several originals as well. And to me, I almost prefer this to the original. It's got stereo in and stereo out. You have the option for the stock sound of the Dimension C, or you can go to the SDD 320. And just, you know, if I turn off the delay and we're just hearing, you know, the chorus, it's a beautiful. It's subtle, but it has a beautiful chiminess. And the one thing that really attracted me to this is that I had learned through researching some things about Stevie Ray Vaughan's tone, is that on a lot of the early records, including the David Bowie Let's Dance, he had used an SDD 320 rack unit in parallel with his dry amplifier. So in the mix bus, they had just blended this in with the original dry sound. And when you hear like songs like Mary Had a Little Lamb, you can hear that there's like a slight chorusing happening when you hear him kind of do that. You can totally hear it when you're listening to that song and you're kind of listening to the chorus. You can hear it even when he's kind of doing like that. You can totally hear that he's using the chorus. It's very, very prominent, very easy to hear when you're listening to that Mary Had a Little Lamb. But this was also just consistent with, again, the other stuff he did with David Bowie. And so I just leave it on. And subtle settings generally, I don't usually leave it on 4, but maybe like on 1, just to add a slight bit of, you know. When I'm using a tube screamer, I'm kind of going for more of a Stevie-ish inspired sound. I'll just leave it on.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and I mean, it's so subtle. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, until you stripped everything back and I was listening, I went, oh, yeah, that's right. He's had this chorus on the whole time.
Yeah, and most of the stuff that we played, that chorus
Yeah,
has been on.
right.
So it just kind of adds a little bit more, as they say, dimension.
Exactly. You got a little motion in it. That's all you want.
Yeah,
man.
and it's subtle. And guys like, Albert King, would do similar things, and they would use phasers or flangers and just like turn the knob off.
Yeah.
And just to kind of create some movement. And I think that that's what he was trying to do with the Dimension C. And that was obviously new technology at the time that a lot of that stuff was recorded.
Right.
Whether he was, with Nile Rodgers producing, or at the helm,
Sure.
or and who knows, that might have been kind of who introduced him to it. Because certainly there was Dimension C on some of that Nile Rodgers stuff, or stuff he was producing for Madonna. Wasn't too long after that. There was certainly a lot of chorus going on some of that stuff. So absolutely amazing pedal. I love how it sounds. So that also is in stereo, and then it goes underneath and feeds a Digitech Polara. Now, the Digitech Polara is probably the best sort of simple 4 knobs in the Truth, and technically it's 3 knobs in the Truth, because one of the knobs is just selecting what type of reverb it is, and then you just have your like reverb level or the mix control, the liveliness, which is kind of more the tone, and then the decay of the reverb. And this, it has Lexicon algorithms in it, because Digitech and Lexicon are under the same Harman umbrella, and it absolutely sounds incredible. And it's in stereo. I usually use it to basically simulate some air in the microphone, especially if we're close miking like we are in this situation. It helps me maybe add in a little bit more room sound or just a little bit more breath behind the notes. And so I usually leave it on just a really subtle setting. And again, it just gives me a little bit more air, a little bit more breathiness to the overall sound. So here it is without it. Here it is with it. Without, with. So it's not a huge thing. It's just kind of, again, another subtlety that kind of just helps, if you're a mediocre guitar player like me, you need to stack the deck in your favor, and just little things like this kind of help move it a little bit more favorable in your direction.
Well, yeah, good point though, but it also like spreads the sound out, and the fact that it's the whole wet, dry, wet thing.
Yeah.
I mean, golly, man, that's not, so it's not really interfering with your guitar tone in
Right.
any way. In fact, it's just adding to.
Yeah,
which is
it's
great.
it's in parallel, and that feeds the very last element, which is the stereo cab Zeus by GFI. And essentially what this does is emulate sort of what would ordinarily be a stereo power amp, stereo cabinets, stereo mics on each one of the cabinets for left and right. And so it has a dedicated XLR for each side of those stereo outs, and then those feed, in this case, I'm hearing it through these Bose powered monitors behind us. But in terms of the DAW, this is just 2 other hard pan channels left and right, and then the dry Fender Deluxe Reverb is just straight up the middle.
Right, right. Or, front of house.
Yeah.
I mean, back through the monitors or whatever.
Yep, could be front of house, or, if you're in in-ears, this is another great way to just really be able to have a more exaggerated mix, because now that everything's in parallel in terms of the delay, the reverb, the modulation, you can mix the relativity of those things relative to the dry channel. So they're not all cascading into each other. When you add more dry, it's intensifying other things. The dry is completely independent of the wet left and right. So you can get much wetter mixes if you desire that, or you can get more subtle mixes the same way that you would if these effects were in the mix bus and you were just blending them in parallel, by way of a fader or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, this is it's like having a console basically, which is, I mean, amazing, because it's literally it's the interface box, and it's the cab Zeus, and it's the custom audio piece, but those 3 little pieces make all the difference.
Yeah, and I think that the cab Zeus is a really simple way to achieve this, because, again, ordinarily you'd need to have another stereo power amp that's at least a single rack unit, if not more, plus 2 more cabinets to get the wet sound into. So this sort of takes the place of a lot of things, and it's still receiving everything from the dry amp as far as the preamp and power amp section. It's just not getting the speaker, because again, it's tapped off before it gets to the speaker, and all the pedals are getting that same signal, as is the cab Zeus. It's just got a digitally emulated cabinet for the wet and digitally emulated microphones, and I've just got a standard kind of SM57 Royer combo set up in it,
Sure.
and then I've got it set to vintage 30s as far as the speaker type. And you can select on there through their software exactly how you want it to be, or you could go on the face of it here and it's got like an edge versus center control, so you can decide like how far away you want it, you know, on the speaker cone in terms of the microphone placement.
Interesting,
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, so another interesting question here. When you're doing this sort of wet, dry, wet thing, how are you adjusting the balance on your individual effects, like on the delay and on the reverb?
Yeah, so it depends on what you have. So like all these have an analog dry path. And in fact, the only digital pedal I have in my sequence is the Polera, the digital reverb.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the cab is just being digital. But all the other effects pedals are all analogs, and they all have analog dry throughs. So if you didn't have an analog dry through, you had something that's, say, like an Eventide, which has like a DSP bypass, those will create some latency if you set them to, say, like 100% wet, or you try to use them in this context. So in that case, you need to use a parallel mixer of some kind in order to create the dry path so you don't get that latency.
Right.
But I have some dry in the wet cabinets, and that's the way that I wanted to do it for this particular rig. And in a lot of the 80s rigs, even Van Halen's, you know, which is a pretty famous wet, dry, wet rig, that had dry in both the cabinets.
Sure.
Later on into the 90s, you'd see more guys go 100% wet in their outside cabinets, and they were still using mixers. They were just, you know, killing the dry completely and setting all the pedals to 100% wet mix, and then using a parallel mixer to kind of blend them in relativity to each other, because they'd usually have multiple mix sections. They'd put like pitch and reverb in one mix, and then they'd feed that into a delay mix or something like that.
Right, right, man. And this is just a really simple way to do it, and it's just kind of to flavor, you know, to taste, however however it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as I said, if you're like me, you're somebody who's not an amazing guitar player but want to sound like you have a little bit more facility, it definitely widens your sounds, makes you feel like you have a little bit more girth and sort of weight behind every single note. One other thing that I should mention is everything is powered by Chalk's power supplies.
Cool.
These are switch mode power supplies that are, you know, fully isolated. And the thing that's really easy from a rig building standpoint, and I'm sure you'll kind of see some of the detail work here, is that firstly, they allow you to vary the voltage on any output. So ordinarily, most power supplies, you may have a few variable voltage outlets on them. So maybe you get 2 or 3 18 volts or that are variable between 9, 12, 15, 18. Every output on the Chalks can be any voltage between 9 and 18 volts. So it makes the routing of the cabling for power really simple, because I can literally put it into any single one of these power outputs, and I don't have to worry about, you know, whether it's going to meet the voltage requirements or not. Secondarily, it also allows you to see on a meter on the actual display, and I've got it covered with my Polera, but it tells you how much of the current capacity that you've used up, and no other power supply does that.
Cool.
So when you're extending it like I am, like I have the main power supply as a Chalk 7, and then that's feeding a Chalks 4, I can see if I keep expanding it, for example, how much of the capacity of the primary supply that has the mains connected to it that's drawing again. So I'm never in danger of drawing more current than the power supply actually provides.
Yeah.
And none of the other supplies I'm aware of that have those extensions tell you where you are in relativity to your total.
Yeah, that's great. And also, man, the Chalk stuff is super lightweight.
It's super lightweight. It's 1 inch high, so it's really low profile.
Yeah.
I've got it wired into our power module, so I have that wired kind of right in here. And I cut down the IEC cord a little bit so it took up less space. And then I also had to cut down the cord of the 68 Univibe from Sabatius, and I just terminated it with like a lamp style plug at the end, and just got that like at a hardware store, and just cut it down to that, and that's also feeding into our power module, which is basically a glorified power strip, but it would be good for somebody who's using multiple power supplies or some pedals that take AC, and you just want to have a single IEC cord that takes it back to the wall.
Yeah, that takes it all out, man. That's great. Yeah, it's a nice solution, man. And that, again, man, super compact size.
Yeah.
Really nice form, man.
Yeah,
Cool.
well, you know, it's a cool system. I'm glad that we've been able to refine it. You know, it got these cool magnetic latches, so when you close it up, it stays closed. It won't open unless you want it to, and the interface thing makes it really easy to, again, to kind of pop out the volume pedal, to be able to use the line out function from the line out box, feed it back in to the pedal board, and I have all my kind of inputs and outputs consolidated. I have my power input consolidated from the AC coming in, and just makes it really simple for setup and tear down.
I was getting ready to say super easy setup, man, super easy tear down, and you just, plug a couple of cables in, you wrap those cables up, you know where they are,
Yep.
it all stays together. Yeah, super organized, man.
Cool.
Very nice. Nice stuff. Mason, sounds great, dude.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for having me for V2.
Thanks for the V2, man. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. This is great, seeing another side of, the same thought process, but it's like, wait a minute, here's something else completely different we can do.
Yeah.
Man. I love it. I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah, well, hopefully you all get some value out of it. Hopefully it gives you some idea of, a new pedal to try out, or another way to maybe run your signal path to get some different tones.
Exactly. Another way of thinking about it all, man.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mason. Appreciate you,
my
man.
pleasure.
Thanks for
My
being
pleasure.
here.
Yeah.